our speak and anyone being able to hear us.
Okay.
Hello, welcome to the second Resistance seminar. I am Eric Clark. I am thrilled to have you here with us, and I am here with a fellow alumna of San Francisco Theological Seminary and friend and co-author of Faithful Resistance, Allison Harrington. She is the pastor of Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, and a leader in the sanctuary movement, and someone who I really admire, and I'm really grateful for her for being with us today to talk about confronting the empire at the border, talk about the nature of empire in our society, and wrestling with its implications, particularly where it comes to looking at the way we treat persons coming into our country from Mexico. So Allison, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Is there anything better than being part of a resistance seminar in this day and age? It's terrific.
Yeah, no, I think it's timely. I can't believe, when Rick and I first began talking about this book and first, started using the metaphor of resistance, we had no idea how perfect and important it was going to be. I mean, this is something Rick said last week. It would have been necessary regardless of the results of the election. It would we didn't suddenly become an empire on January 20th. But the sudden awareness that's arising in many of the people in our society of that reality is refreshing and exciting. I'm hoping that we can translate that into a variety of meaningful actions and movements, which transform our world for the better. Mm-hmm. So, Allison, I wonder if you could just start by telling us a little bit of your story, a little bit of the story of Southside's work. I know it goes back before you, but the work that Southside has been doing, and what the sanctuary movement is, so that we have a little bit of context for the conversation this morning. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been the pastor here at Southside since January of 2009. Southside Presbyterian Church is a little tiny church of about 150 members, 60 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border. And it's been around since 1906. It was founded as a mission church for the Tohono O'odham people when folks were migrating from the reservation into town for work. They went to the local Presbyterian church, and a local Presbyterian church said, "Oh, that's great, you've been baptized Presbyterian, but you're Indians and we don't want to worship with you." And so they established a mission church for those Native Americans. And it was they met originally in a tent back in 1906. So it has a long tradition of serving those who have been excluded and those who have been kind of pushed out, those who have been told there is no room for you here. So because Southside has been in the barrio for all of these years, what it has meant for us to do ministry is not just limited to worship on a Sunday. It's not enough for us to care for people's spiritual lives when they're getting beat up, literally, every other day of the week. And so for us, I've really come to understand the work of Southside is the pastoral is political when you're dealing with those who are persecuted and oppressed and excluded. So the church has a long history of involvement in social justice issues. They were very active in housing rights, and they were very active in the movement to desegregate public facilities and the civil rights movement, active in solidarity work with Wounded Knee back in the 1970s. And then in the 1980s was when we kind of engaged in the work that we are now known for, and that is the work of sanctuary. So back in the 1980s, there was the civil wars in Central America that was causing a huge migration of people fleeing death squads, fleeing torture, coming up to into our our country. And what they were fleeing, looking for asylum, they were refugees fleeing these civil wars, and they were not given refugee status. They weren't treated as asylum seekers, and instead they were being deported right back to the death squads that they were fleeing from. And so Yeah,
I think
go
it's
ahead.
worth mentioning here that a number of the regimes and the death squads from which they were fleeing were regimes that were being financially and militarily propped up, supported by the U.S. government of the time.
Yeah.
So they were the fact that they weren't being granted refugee status was political in nature. That we were denying them refugee status because we were supportive of the regimes that they were fleeing from.
Yeah, it wasn't just an oversight. It was like, we are part of this violence. It wasn't just like, oh, we don't know what's going on down there. It was like we knew in detail what was happening there, and we're part of, like you said, creating that situation. So when people of faith and conscience realized that was what was happening, they realized they needed to switch their tactics, because at first they were going to these detention centers in El Centro, California, and helping to type out asylum paperwork for folks. They were working night and day trying to crank out as much asylum paperwork as possible. When they realized that wasn't gonna work, they decided to shift their strategy, and they decided to help people cross over the border quietly, without anybody knowing, and then take refuge in churches like Southside and other churches here along the U.S.-Mexico border in Arizona. And then they would stay in churches like Southside for a couple days, a couple months, and then they would then there was an underground network of churches where they could kind of spread out into the United States and remain safe. And this is what became known as the sanctuary movement. Who we are as a congregation, that consumed our life for 10 years. And so we are known as the sanctuary church in a lot of ways. But after the peace accords were signed in 92, 93, the sanctuary movement kind of officially drew to a close. And we didn't really engage in the work of sanctuary until 2014. There was a resurgence of the sanctuary movement in 2006, but we weren't engaged in that work at that time. We were doing other kind of stuff. But 2014, we began to see the rising rates of deportation under the Obama administration. And I think this is an important thing to point out, that that although we're very concerned about the policies that 45 is implementing, things have not been good under the Obama administration. There have been record rates of deportation, and in fact, at one time, 45 said he wanted to deport 3 million. Well, that's just about what Obama had deported in his 8 years. So when these rising rates of deportation were happening, faith leaders and just people of faith and conscience just felt compelled. How are we going to respond? We're seeing a complete lack of leadership on this issue coming out of DC. So how are we going to stand up and do something about the destruction of families and the devastation of communities that we're seeing? And so we began to kind of whisper the word sanctuary, and we would kind of use it as a threat. When we were talking to ICE about particular cases, we're like, well, you should really close their case because you should know we're thinking about sanctuary, because we thought that would really freak them out. And actually, it did work in the very beginning. We were getting cases closed, like, no, don't do sanctuary again. We remember that. But then it stopped. Then it stopped working, and we thought that, we always think. Well, I always think I'm scarier than I actually am, and more of a threat than I actually am. I think Department of Homeland Security is gonna be like, no, Pastor, please don't quote scripture at us. No, anything but that. That's actually not the case. So Daniel, there's a man in our community by the name of Daniel, and we have a legal clinic that meets at our church, and he came to the legal clinic and he had a final order of deportation. And he shouldn't have had a final order of deportation because he was not in the category of people who should be a priority. He should have had what's called a favorable exercise of prosecutorial discretion. And let me explain what that is very briefly. So under the Obama administration, even before then, the Department of Homeland Security and the White House said, we don't have the political will or the desire or even the mechanisms to deport 11 million people. And so we need to find a way to direct the the department's resources in a way to go after the people we think should be a priority for deportation. And so they had all these memos around prosecutorial discretion.
Which, incidentally, is and again, this is sort of drawing the connection to the reality that as much as we oppose the policies of 45 are not that distinct from what has come before in some ways. The actual practice of that was essentially to use the same rhetoric of bad hombres, essentially aiming for what they were saying were the worst of the undocumented persons present, targeting people who had any kind of criminal conviction or any entanglement with law enforcement specifically to remove. So, I mean, that essentially has already been our policy for some time.
Yeah, that's right. And there's been kind of this narrative of the good immigrant and the bad immigrant. And I'm really proud of the work that churches have done within the sanctuary movement of really doing our best to not fall into that kind of framework. Because there's a lot of reasons not to fall into that framework. There's kind of the moral, theological reasons of understanding that we're a people of grace and forgiveness, we're a people of second chances. There's all of that. And then there's also the political understanding of the way in which communities of color are policed and people of color are sentenced in different ways than white people are. And so it's like, and so that's the whole problem with the sanctuary cities thing. It's not just about saying we're not gonna check for your immigration status. It's about looking at how is policing being done in our cities in disparate ways. So you had this whole prosecutorial discretion memo that said these are the good people, these are the bad people, which is problematic. But the practices were still going after people who the government said we shouldn't be going after. So there was a problem with policy and practice. It was out of step, and so the policy was, hey, parents of U.S. citizens, leave them alone. But we were seeing parents of U.S. citizens being targeted. And so Daniel was one of those cases where his case should have been closed. And yet he was looking at a final order of deportation. And so there was really nothing else for him to do. It was at the end of his whole kind of immigration proceedings cases. And so our session voted to take him into sanctuary, our church governing body. And I never actually thought he would go into sanctuary. Again, I thought they would be totally scared of us. And I thought they would hear, oh, they're doing a press conference. They're welcoming this guy into sanctuary. We have to don't let them do this again. But when it was May 14th, it was the beginning of May 2014. And we're walking into the church and I'm in my robes, all these clergy are in their robes and Daniel and his family are there. And we're walking in and I'm like, okay, we're doing this. Because I actually thought we were going to get a call being like, please, pastor, no, anything but sanctuary. And then we told Daniel, we said they're going to call us tomorrow and be like, no, he can have a stay of deportation. He was in sanctuary for 28 days, which we thought was an impossibly long time. And he was able to leave. And then we had Rosa enter sanctuary, and she was with us for 461 days. Which was a very long time. Mm-hmm. And so this kind of led us back into this work of sanctuary, which has now, before the election, we had, it's always hard to count very accurately how many churches are engaged in the work, because there's a lot of people engaged in the work who we just don't know about, who are doing the work of sanctuary quietly. But we were estimating about 300 to 400 before the election. Since the election, those numbers have skyrocketed. We're at 700-800 now. And every single day we get calls from people saying, we want to do the work of sanctuary. Help us figure that out.
That's great. That's amazing. And are you finding the capacity to be able to do that, training and leadership and equipping for other churches? Or, how is that being done?
We are ramping up our capacity. It's been a little bit of a struggle, just because as a movement, we don't have staff, we don't have funding. We're all kind of doing this because we're passionate about it, and we're doing it on the margins of our time. And so first and foremost, I'm the pastor of Southside, but I'm also part of trying to resource and build this movement. we're because we do have so many people who are engaged in the work. There's trainings happening all over the nation every single day. They're small ones, they're big ones, but we're training a ton of people right now.
So Dexter Kearney is in our is in the chat right now, and he's been watching the video, and he's asking just specifically, how does a church become a sanctuary church?
That's a really great question. It's a process of discernment on the part of a congregation. There's not like, some people have asked, oh, well, do you fill a form out with the government? But there's no, like, you can't go to departmentofhomelandsecurity.gov and like download your form to become a sanctuary church. It's something that you discern as a congregation, and then usually most congregations have some kind of public declaration of that. And it depends on the polity of your church in terms of who makes that decision. So for us, the first time we discerned sanctuary, it was just our session, our governing body who did the vote. The second time when Rosa came into sanctuary, we had a congregational meeting about it. And so we really encourage pastors and congregational leaders to educate their congregation about the issues that are happening, to preach about our values as people of faith when it comes to welcoming the stranger and loving our neighbor, and then having conversations. A lot of our churches have gone through this kind of process in becoming fully inclusive churches, whether it's More Light in the Presbyterian Church or Open and Affirming or whatever that is. A lot of us have that experience of doing that kind of congregational conversation. And so those same muscles, those same skills that you used when you discerned what your stance was going to be on LGBTQ issues, or the same process you went through to figure out you're going to do a capital campaign of having conversations with people, having one-on-one conversations, framing it theologically. All those are kind of the ways in which you can begin the conversation. And then it's always, we're really encouraging congregations who are wanting to discern to be in communication with community organizations in their own locality. So is there an immigrant rights organization? Is there a day labor center? Who out there who is directly affected is doing the work right now, so you can be in communication with them. And I'll say one of the things that we are encouraging people to do is discern that work of sanctuary. Can your church physically house someone? What does that look like? And what do you need to do congregationally to make that discernment? But also, what is needed right now? Because actually, what is needed right now isn't necessarily sanctuary, but we need rapid response systems. We need childcare for community meetings, so undocumented parents can attend Know Your Rights trainings. People need to use our copiers to copy their training materials. There's all these kinds of ways to engage in working as allies in this fight right now.
That's awesome. And there are other resources out there that I've been seeing. So for example, the Synod of the Northeast hosted a webinar about this, which is still available online that you can watch. And I'm sure that a lot of regions are also doing training in their region. I know it's happening here in Portland, that there's been quite an active group of people hosting events at different churches talking about how to get involved in the sanctuary movement. So there might be something happening locally where members of your church could go to sort of get connected with other people in your area who are trying to do some of this sanctuary work to get some of it started. So there are a few different ways to start to resource and equip a church that was interested in pursuing this further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and folks can go, we have our website is sanctuarynotdeportation.org. And on that website, you can find the toolkits, resources, webinars, but really, so that kind of exists for people to plug into and get those resources, and we're constantly adding to that. Again, that's sanctuarynotdeportation.org. But people can also, but really, we're really encouraging people to just find out who's in your neighborhood. This work right now, there's the national strategy is very difficult because we're not going to have a conscience to appeal to in DC. So it's all about really establishing strong local relationships. And it's that fundamental grassroots organizing that we're going to need in the next 4 years.
And I think that this is something that's maybe worth spending a little time talking about, Allison. This is something that I've been trying to emphasize in my own preaching, and something that I think is really crucial to the basics of doing what I term liberation work, liberation theology stuff, which is to say that it has to be based in relationship. So many people start from a position of, there is an issue I want to tackle, I want to engage this issue, and that's great. I'm glad that you're seeing something in the society that you recognize as injustice and you want to respond to that injustice. But a fundamental disconnect that often happens is that we're talking about churches, in my context, Presbyterian churches, that are middle class and they're white and they're segregated. They're segregated racially, they're segregated by class, they're segregated, in all of these ways that mean that they don't actually know anyone directly for whom the issue that they're upset about is, more than just an abstract issue, but a personal daily issue, struggle. And so I think it's about beginning to develop those relationships, because part of what can happen is this sort of white savior syndrome where we rush in to save everyone and we think we have all the answers and the solutions. Frequently we mess it up, we do more harm than good, or we're just insensitive and just awkward in the process of doing that. And so I really encourage people that a lot of this kind of justice work, a lot of liberation work, really depends on becoming closely related with the people who you want to ally with and responding rather than initiating, responding to their requests, listening so that when it comes time to act, the action flows from the need, from the stated need, from the requested need of the person you're assisting, coming from an assumed need that you're sort of projecting onto them.
Yeah, I mean that's perfectly said. Because I do think, we're known as doing the work of sanctuary, but I tell you, like the work that has been most appreciated by folks has been the work of childcare and the work of like running 500 flyers. Like that's huge, so that people can just supporting the work that is being done is so important. The problem that we're running into is that doing childcare is not sexy, and everyone wants to do like the sexy work of the resistance. But like when you're an ally, like you just like get in where you fit in, see a gap and fill it. And right now, people need childcare. Like I'm a mom of 2 small children, and I can't go to half the stuff I want to go to because it is really expensive to get a babysitter. And so we need to resource our Sunday school teachers and our nursery workers to do this work. And it doesn't matter if it's not sexy, because it's not about what's sexy. It's about what does solidarity mean in this moment. And there is fundamentally a huge challenge with the work of sanctuary. And that is that there's a lot of people doing sanctuary right now, and there's a lot of Latino congregations who are doing it quietly. The ones who are kind of doing it more publicly tend to be middle class, mainline white congregations who are taking in undocumented person. And there's a fundamental power dynamic there that has to be acknowledged. And how are we making sure that work of sanctuary is done alongside the person and not for them? Because you're right, we have to break out of this white savior formation, and we have to really enter into a praxis of solidarity.
And that just brings up an interesting point that, when I think of all the congregations that I'm aware of, and Southside is preeminent among them, that are famous for doing sanctuary work, that, they're all white congregations. And of course, it's unsurprising to me that there are a number of Latino congregations that are doing this work quietly. And I think that might actually be communicating something about the fact that the risk that a Latino congregation takes doing this work is probably different than the risk that a white congregation takes doing this work. And the choice to be public about it might be a choice that is available to a white congregation, or a privileged choice, a choice that comes from a confidence, a security in our own safetyness. We can confront empire without really worrying that much that the backlash of empire is going to come down too hard on us.
I kind of agree with that. I agree with that to the extent that I think that we have to use our privilege we have to wield it as a weapon against the power structure. We have to use our privilege in a strategic way to dismantle our systems of privilege. So I absolutely 100% agree with that. I think there's something really powerful about church ladies, you know, really being, you know, on the front lines of a movement, you know,
Yeah.
or part of, you know, like part of that, saying kind of this is eroding a fundamental part of our faith. And especially right now when we're kind of grappling as, for myself, and I know for you, like as white people, understanding that white Christians elected Trump, right?
Right.
They're clearly nominally Christians. I shouldn't say that, but come on. But what does it mean for white Christians to also be on the forefront of a movement of resistance? I do think that that the work now is riskier than it has been before. And so I don't feel like the level of protection and privilege that I felt before the election is greatly diminished for me. And so it's interesting because, you know, we stand in solidarity with those who are called criminal and those who are called illegal. And I think that at any day, the administration could turn their focus onto the churches doing this work, and they could call us criminal and illegal. And so we enter into a different kind of space where the privilege that we might have once had now is eroded, which is it's just a different kind of moment, I think, politically.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. I mean, we're seeing that in the you know, journalists being called enemies, and you know, institutions that fundamentally before were viewed as part of the civic fabric now being attacked, if not loyal to the particular regime or to the party, then suddenly the you know, they're no longer no longer part of the same team. They're now enemies or opponents. And so that is I think that's a real dynamic that is happening right now in our culture, in our society. So Matt Price put in here a question he's interested in. On the subject of Latino versus white churches doing sanctuary work, what might you have to say to for a white church that rents to a Latino church? How can white churches who own the property work with their tenant congregations? Is there a way to approach that you might have some advice for?
That's a great question. Whoever asked that question, figure it out and let us know, because that's a really good. That's what I say to people like, I don't know, figure it out and then let us know. I mean, that's a amazing situation, and that's common as well. I mean, I think it's about being in relationship. I mean, a lot of times I feel like churches who have a nesting congregation in them don't always have like a relationship with one another. It's kind of, you're using the facility. And so what does it mean to have a potluck together? What does it mean to meet with that pastor to say, what are your concerns right now? But it does bring up issues, especially if that white congregation is wanting to do the work of sanctuary. Depending on where that church is in the nation, they need to be in communication with those who are using the space, right? Because all of a sudden, like in some places, like ICE has hung outside of a church, and so if you have a Latino congregation who may or may not have undocumented folks in there, they need to know that the church is going to have a higher profile than they did before, and people need to feel safe to come to church still, if that makes sense. There's some really interesting. So I would say it's all about relationship, all about communicating, finding out what do they need, how can that congregation work in partnership with one another, and that may not be doing sanctuary. That congregation may say, you know what, if you all do sanctuary and you're going to be holding press conferences here and doing this very public work, a lot of our members aren't going to feel safe coming here anymore because they don't want to be, for whatever reason. And so it might be that you decide to do sanctuary in a different kind of way. I will mention that there is a kind of a different trajectory of this work that is happening right now, called the Matthew 25 Pledge, that is being that Sojourners is hosting, along with Alexia Salvatierra, amazing organizer, faith-rooted organizer. And it's a way for specifically evangelical Christian churches to engage in the work by taking the Matthew 25 Pledge. And there's all these toolkits that exist, and I think people can find that just by Googling the Matthew 25 Pledge. And it's the idea is that it's a way for evangelical congregations who might be afraid, or even Latino congregations who might be afraid of the word sanctuary, to engage in different levels of the work.
That's interesting. This actually came up recently in a conversation I was having in my presbytery level. I was doing a presentation on various forms of engagement and resistance in our society, and sanctuary was mentioned. And there was someone who said, "Well, I think we need to avoid using the word sanctuary." And because the word sanctuary is a trigger word, right? It's a hot button word. And my response was, but it's our word, right? I mean, we are sitting, at the time we were at a presbytery meeting, we were sitting in the sanctuary of a church. At what point do we become afraid to use our own theology, our own terms? And I wonder if you might say something about the theology of choosing to name the movement a sanctuary movement and what it means to talk about sanctuary. This is perhaps a concept which is an older Christian concept that's being revived.
Yeah, it's definitely our word. It goes back to the Old Testament, to the establishment of sanctuary cities as places of refuge for those who had committed a crime, but the punishment for the crime was disproportionate, and so they needed to be able to flee from a family who was trying to have retribution. And then it continued through the Roman Empire and through the Middle Ages. Folks, if you have kids like I do, you've seen The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and that wonderful scene. Whenever I talk about sanctuary with youth, I always show that scene of Quasimodo taking Esmeralda in the cartoon, and he scoops her up, rescues her from persecution, and climbs up Notre Dame and says, "Sanctuary, sanctuary." And so it's this long practice of the state saying we will not encroach in on sacred spaces, and those will be kind of places that are set aside. Interestingly enough, when they were thinking about how to frame the work that they were doing in the 1980s, Jim Corbett, who was one of the founders of the movement, was one of the main kind of thinkers and architects of the movement, he pointed to two historical moments. He pointed to the way in which some churches engaged in the Underground Railroad. He was a Quaker, and so of course the Quakers were very involved in the Underground Railroad, and so he pointed to that moment and the way in which churches helped enslaved Africans escaping from slavery, moving into freedom. And then he also pointed to the failure of the church in Europe to shelter Jews during World War II. But interestingly, actually, when sanctuary was first invoked here in the United States was during the Vietnam War. And I only found this out maybe a year ago. I didn't know this part of the history, but when young men were refusing to go to war, the conscious objectors would often take sanctuary in churches. And actually, unfortunately, at that point, they were law enforcement was going in, apprehending them, dragging them out of churches. And so when that obviously wasn't a hugely popular thing to see have happen in a church. And so that was when the sensitive locations kind of policy and practices were established. And that is a policy that exists so far. We haven't got an executive order about that one yet. That places like houses of worship, schools and hospitals are sensitive locations, and law enforcement should they shouldn't enter into those spaces. And so to use the term sanctuary is a deeply theological and a deeply biblically rooted concept. It is interesting because when you hear sanctuary, most these days you hear about sanctuary cities, which is a different kind of thing altogether. But the word is still, I think, a useful word to use. But I think that we need to expand notions of what sanctuary is. After the Pulse nightclub shooting, there was this filmmaker who wrote an article about that, and she said, for those of us who are queer, churches have never been sanctuary spaces. Clubs have been our sanctuary spaces, and in this moment, a sanctuary space was violated. And organizers have been pushing us and really leading the way to helping us think about sanctuary as something broader than just the four walls of a congregation. Rather, it's a way in which we create safe communities together, communities of human rights and dignity, knowing that in this moment, the only safe places we're going to find are the places that we create ourselves.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting, I mean, that follows, for me, I look at the connection for what you're describing between the sanctuary movement and, say, the Underground Railroad and the abolition movement. And I think about the fact that, you know, in the Underground Railroad was a complex network. There were all of these levels and ways in which people engaged, and some people ran, you know, safe houses, places where escaping slaves could be kept, you know, hidden temporarily before they could be moved on to the next place. But those places were, you know, they were way stations, they were stops, they were along the way. They were not intended to be a final place, similar to the idea that when a person enters in sanctuary in a church, the hope is that they're there temporarily and that the deportation order or whatever it is that's threatening them is defeated, and they're able to then be safe again outside the walls of the church. And so I think that that relationship between a safe space we create, which is temporary, but aiming toward the goal of changing the world outside that safe space so that that safe space no longer becomes necessary. You know, the object of the Underground Railroad is abolition. It's the ending of slavery. It's not sufficient to just have safe spaces and have people in safe spaces. Those safe spaces are themselves a tool to try and push and leverage the rest of society toward a more just way of acting, a more just way of being.
Yeah, exactly. And so we tell people, you know, do the work of discernment about sanctuary, but then go out and make sure that sanctuary is not necessary. Because we don't want people, the goal is not to have people in sanctuary. Having someone in sanctuary is a really hard thing. So we need to make sure that we are working alongside folks to create communities that are safe, so people don't have to enter into sanctuary. And I think that there's kind of two goals of sanctuary, and one is kind of that radical hospitality and radical protection that we provide someone who's being persecuted, and that can be done in a public way or a private way. Privately, we're seeing and encouraging folks, if an executive order comes out, or if someone has a final order of deportation and they need to figure out what to do, they could come into private sanctuary in a church for a few days, consult with lawyers, figure out what their options are, and maybe relocate, maybe kind of go into the shadows, so to speak. So there's going to be some ways in which sanctuary is that way station to somewhere else that might be safer. But then when we talk about public sanctuary, part of that is to lift up the story and to lift up the voice of the person in sanctuary for the purpose of changing hearts and minds, and so that policy would then also change. Yeah.
Well, and you talked about in the earlier incarnation of the sanctuary movement, the incarnation that was in the 80s, that there was this network of churches that people were they were being moved. They were being distributed throughout to try and move them around the society. And that was part of the resistance, right? Because the idea was to make it hard for the government to be able to deport these people by moving them around to new places and having them deeper into the country, maybe not near the ports and entryways where ICE is looking for them. And so I think that's an aspect of it as well. So a question that's on my mind, and I think probably on other people's minds if they're thinking about it, is how to respond to this sort of feeling of it being overwhelming at the present moment. The numbers seem overwhelming. The implacable and grim approach of the current administration seems overwhelming. When we're talking about the objective of deporting 3 million people, which, as you point out, is what Obama deported over his 8 years. But if that were to be tried to be done in a year or two, or even 4 years, the ramping up of that scale of activity would be massive, and would be just this huge machine. We're probably talking about essentially concentration camps and huge infrastructure having to be created in order to be able to do this. How do you how do you sustain energy for resistance, motivation for resistance? How do you strategically look at how do you resist when you're facing something potentially of that scale, when we're talking about something that massive?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When you figure out the answer to that, please also let me know that. I think that, I think that right now in this moment, in these like first almost 3 weeks now, it's just kind of crisis mode, crisis mode, crisis mode. And so, and there's marches every day, and there's just so much happening. And so I've really been conscious about my own level of participation in a lot of things. And so I don't go to every march because I'm in it for the long haul, and I need to make sure that like I'm taking care of myself and my family and my children and my church, as well as working on this kind of like massive scale building of a resistance. And so I just think it's just finding that balance of, okay, so every time I talk, I always quote Valerie Carr, and I hope that everybody has seen, she did this really powerful little talk at a watch night service with William Barber. And Valerie Carr is like my hero. She's a Sikh activist. She's terrific. And she says, the quote is longer than this, but the essence of the quote is, maybe the darkness that we're facing is not the darkness of the grave, but is the darkness of the womb. And then she says, and we need to remember what the midwives tell us. The midwives tell us to breathe, and then the midwives tell us to push. And so I am more aware now than I've ever been before of the importance of breathing, of really rooting myself in whatever practice sustains me, because if I do not do that, I will not be able to push. It's just as simple as that. And we are trying to give birth to the kingdom of God, right? The beloved kingdom, the beloved community. We're trying to birth something. We're co-creators with God in the world that we want to live in. And so we need to be breathing. And so it is very overwhelming. And you and I were talking before we went live about, like, last night I had a hard time sleeping because I was just filled with anxiety, and I just think it's difficult. It's a difficult moment. And so I do think we need to really protect our worship spaces. And that's been something that I've been really, really aware of, even in the election. I was aware of the fact that I needed space from those politicians, because in particular 45 was everywhere. Like, you turned on like, he was everywhere. He was like colonizing my mind and my body and my soul. And I knew that when I went into worship, I needed to dwell in a different space. And so as political as a church as Southside is, when you come to worship, you don't hear a lot of that politics because everyone is hearing it every single day. We're all on the same page. People don't need to be convinced that what is happening is bad. And so a lot of what we're doing in worship is just is fortifying ourselves, is really is worshiping joyfully, knowing that we belong body and soul to Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, and no one else. And every single Sunday we've been singing the song, this joy that I have, the world didn't give it to me, the world didn't give it, and the world can't take it away. And so we're really trying to make sure that we understand that we belong to God, and that we do not belong to any administration. And I think that by having worship that is joyful, even in the midst of this, has been the only way in which I've been able to survive these past couple months.
Yeah, wow, that's powerful. That song is powerful, and the metaphor of birth used in that way, I think, is really interesting. The alternating of the breath and the pushing, and as a father who has attended and delivered both of my children, one aspect of that metaphor that I think is really intriguing in this instance is that the rhythm of breathing and pushing is dictated by nature, by the woman's body. It tells her when it's time to push, and then when it's not time to push, it's time to breathe, because you need every single second to breathe that you can in between the time of pushing, because the pushing is intense. And I think there is an element to that with activism, where when you get into the work, you get into the community, and you start to do it, the times to push become apparent, and they come upon you, and it's like, okay, this is a time to push, and then you push and you push and you push, and then the moment that the time to push passes, it's time to breathe and take every single moment and every single second you can to take that breath and do that breath, because when the time to push comes again, it will be time to push. And so I think that recognizing and being able to sink into that rhythm could be a powerful powerful practice for people who are engaging in this work. Linda Eastwood.
Yeah, and I think,
oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, someone had posted on Facebook this metaphor from music. I don't sing, which is why I didn't sing you that song. And it was when a choir is needing to hold a note for a very long time, they stagger the breaths. So different people take breaths at different times during that long note, so that the music continues, and different people are breathing at different times. And so I think this is the power of doing this work in community too, knowing that, hey, you know what, maybe I'm not going to that march, but I know other folks are, or maybe I'm not involved in this particular campaign, but because I'm involved in this aspect of the work. That's the beauty of the community, that we're all kind of breathing and pushing in different ways, so that there is this constant note of resistance, but we're all able to breathe within that.
That's great too. So Linda Eastwood remarked in the feed, she says, University Church Chicago, also a sanctuary church, partnered with local organizations of undocumented immigrants who were pretty much in charge of our sanctuary accompaniment and other support. Even in our mixed race, mostly black-white church, we found this is a really rich way of trying to avoid the savior complex. Yep. Has any of the same kind of partnership been available or useful to Southside or other churches that you know about?
Yeah, the Chicago is a great model. They're doing amazing work in Chicago. Cynthia Rodriguez is the organizer there, and Julian Deschache. They're terrific. They're amazing. So what we are finding is the strongest work and the kind of most principled work is the work that is being done when a church is part of a coalition. So for instance, there in Portland, when Francisco was in sanctuary at Augustana Lutheran, they were working very closely with Emerge, which is the local immigrant rights organization. Same thing in Philadelphia, and in different places, and here in Tucson as well. We're finding that the best way to break down that white savior formation is not just having white people in charge of stuff, is working in coalition with local groups. So yeah, that is definitely key. And one of the great joys of this work is is learning from the other coalitions and what they're doing.
And then Susan Borer, who is also commenting in the feed, she's from Australia, and she's noting that with regards to concentration camps, her strong recommendation would be to do everything you can to prevent them from being built or set up. Their experience with the Australian refugee camps in Nauru and Manos is that once they're set up, it's very difficult to bring sufficient political pressure to get them closed again. And the likelihood of human rights violations by the staff of those camps is huge. I think that that's a really important point, and it brings to mind to me potentially a different aspect of the movement, which would in some ways be more analogous to what's being done at Standing Rock, which is possibly the necessity at some point, if we see that infrastructure being built for massive deportation, if we see that move being made in that way, including, for example, the building of a larger and more obnoxious border wall, that it might become necessary to sort of put bodies in the way, and privileged bodies, ideally, to put bodies in the way to say, we're not going to stand by and allow this to be done. We're actually going to physically oppose it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Huge shout out to Australia. They're doing terrific work down there. They declared sanctuary, it was about a year ago. Many of their cathedrals and churches stood up and said, we're declaring sanctuary. And they didn't have the same kind of history that we did. So they were really charting new ground, and they're just doing terrific work. But it's true. We need to understand, where is empire working in the world, and what is our call to interrupt, disrupt, and dismantle empire at every single moment. And so we've had people in Tucson who put their bodies underneath Border Patrol vehicles to prevent them from taking away a community member. It's very inspiring. The Tohono O'odham Nation, which borders the U.S.-Mexico border, has said, you're not building a wall on our land. And so there are all these folks who are standing up to say the mechanisms of empire as they relate to deportation will not be built in our community.
Yeah. And in fact, in your chapter here in Faithful Resistance, that's, you actually use that language of disrupting the machinery of empire as what is a way to describe the work that's there. And I think this is a change for many people. Many Christians are used to, many Christians in the US, particularly many Presbyterian Christians in the US, are accustomed to the relationship of our faith to our society to mainly be one of persuasion, or to be one of, leading by example, or holding out ideals, or calling it to be its best version of itself. But they're all sort of gentle ways of describing or framing the relationship between the church and society. Even when they talk about the church serving as like the conscience of society, that brings to mind these ideas of sort of like wagging your finger at people and saying, naughty, naughty, make sure you do better next time. And this language that I'm encouraging people, I'm calling these the resistance seminars, the language of the book Faithful Resistance, and what you're talking about there about disruption strikes people as more confrontational than they're used to, and as something that many people haven't been comfortable with, or maybe still aren't comfortable with. So I wonder if you might say something about possibly helping people to come to terms or comfortable why this stronger language is merited, and how you disciple people into understanding their relationship to society in this more stronger stance.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think that this moment is leading us to bolder actions. And I think for us, it's the mandates of our faith, I know the executive orders of Jesus, right? They're found in Matthew 25. And, I get why people are hesitant. And I get that. I do get that. And I think that all of us are called to kind of push in different ways. But I just know that I'm called to push hard and out front, because like the choice I made when I was 7 years old. And that was the choice when I decided to become a Christian and became baptized. That was the choice. After that, everything is like commandment. In a way, like people say, well, you made this choice to do sanctuary. It's like, this is not a choice. Like, this is a commandment from Christ. Like Matthew 25 is really super pretty clear, that my very salvation is dependent on my actions in this moment. And so it's not a choice. I don't get to choose whether I stand with the oppressed. It's a commandment. And so the choice that I made when I was 7 years old, when I said, Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior. When I made that choice to say, Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, everything else falls in line from that. And what that means in this moment is some pretty radical acts of resistance, because it is saying that above all, and I think that the Confessing Church of Europe has a lot to teach us about what faithfulness looks like in this moment. And so I'm not going to say it's not frightening at times, because you think you're just going about your life kind of preaching what you know to be true, and at any moment that could be a moment of confrontation with empire, and you haven't set it up to be that way. Like I'm not really setting out to like confront empire. Like I'm setting out to be faithful. But in this particular moment, there is a conflict that is on the horizon. And we don't know how big that conflict is going to be.
I know the executive orders of Jesus, they're found in Matthew 25. Wow.
Yeah, right?
Dang,
they
Allison.
are. It's like, it's clear. Like I just, yeah. And I also know, But I will say in the sanctuary work, you know, my faith compels me clearly, right? But also like who I am as a mother also really compels me. And so I think that there's like the executive orders of motherhood of like, I can't, you know, there was a conversion moment that I had when, and I talk about this all the time because it was kind of my conversion moment into a more radical level of this work. I was driving in Tucson with my oldest, who's almost 5. She was like 6 months at the time. Police officer pulls up behind me. She's snug in her car seat. And whenever police officer pulls up behind us, we always do the same thing. Every one of us, regardless of who we are, we do the same thing. We kind of quickly check our speedometer. We put our hands at 10 and 2. We like, are we texting? You know, is our seatbelt on? And as soon as I realized that I was fine, I hadn't broken any rules, I relaxed and I could breathe. And that relaxation went through my shoulders. And I have long understood that relaxation to be the embodiment of white privilege, because I don't look like Sandra Bland, who would have been 30 yesterday. I don't look like Sandra Bland, and so I can relax in the presence of law enforcement. But what I realized in that moment of relaxation and breathing deeply with a police officer behind me, I realized that there was undocumented mothers in my city who could not relax in the same way. And that they could be driving to drop their kids off at school. They could be driving to get milk, and their child could be taken from them. And that cuts so deep into my heart, the idea that moms could be separated from their children. I can't allow that to happen. And I have to do everything I can to stand with other moms who love their children just as much as I do. And so, yeah, this moment that we're in requires bold and brave action.
Definitely.
Because to fail to act is to fail to be good parents and to be good Christians.
And when I have preached Matthew 25 in the past, one of the aspects of that passage that has long haunted me is not the sense that, you know, when Jesus says, well, you failed to do this, so, you know, off to the fire, or you succeeded to do this, so off to the reward. But the awareness that every time I have failed to welcome a stranger, to feed the hungry, to do the things that are commanded in Matthew 25, that I have failed Jesus. I have failed, like every hungry person I haven't fed is Jesus that I have let be hungry. And to me, that moves me to a particular place of contrition where I recognize that, you know, I don't know, my existential identity, my sense of self, my faith, my very being is challenged to understand that, you know, every instance of compassion that I show or do not show is an instance of compassion that I show or do not show, not just for Jesus, but also to Jesus. And that is compels me into further action.
Yeah.
So, Allison, that was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for taking this time this morning to be with me here. And I hope that people got a lot out of it. We had about 40 people on most of the time. And I hope that people will continue reading Faithful Resistance. Next week, we're going to be talking about white supremacy. We're going to be talking about Black Lives Matter. Ananda Barclay is going to be on here with me. And we're going to be talking about the ways that the church has and has not engaged well with the Black Lives Matter movement and its current incarnations of civil rights and racial justice movements in the United States. So I hope that people will join us for that conversation. I hope that you guys will look in the links below and follow Allison's work in the link she gave for how you can learn more, sanctuarynotdeportation.org, and continue to find ways to resist, continue to find ways to oppose what is inhuman in our society, and to lift up the deeply human and deeply loving way of Christ.